Dawn had barely settled over London when the first signs of disruption appeared, not in headlines, not in broadcasts, but in silence. Courtyard traffic slowed. Staff moved with unusual precision. Doors that were normally left open were closed. At exactly 9:07 a.m., an internal communication was circulated through secure channels, stamped with language rarely used in modern times. Procedural suspension pending verification. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply froze motion. Inside the palace system, a freeze is not symbolic. It is mechanical. Files cannot advance. Titles cannot be amended. Registries cannot be updated. The monarchy, an institution built on continuity, had deliberately chosen to pause itself. For those tasked with protecting its structure, hesitation was safer than error. For the first time in years, lineage was being treated not as heritage, but as a matter requiring examination. Officials understood the gravity immediately. The question was not whether a child belonged to a family. The question was whether recognition could occur without process. In constitutional terms, recognition is an act of state. It carries legal meaning, historical precedent, and irreversible consequence. Once entered into record, it cannot easily be undone. That permanence is what demanded caution. The request that triggered the review had arrived days earlier, delivered not through ceremony but through legal channels. Documentation had been assembled to establish clarity, to remove doubt, to secure acknowledgement. Under ordinary circumstances, such materials might have been accepted with little resistance. But these were not ordinary circumstances. The modern monarchy exists in a world of international jurisdictions, private laboratories, digital evidence, and competing legal standards. Verification now meant navigating realities that tradition never anticipated. Senior advisors gathered to assess the submission. Their role was not to judge intention. Their role was to evaluate method. Every document, every signature, every transfer of information had to meet a threshold defined not by sentiment, but by institutional survivability. If the Crown validated evidence once without scrutiny, it could be compelled to do so again. A single exception can become precedent. Precedent can reshape authority. Beyond the palace walls, the public still saw only fragments. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration, only the absence of confirmation. Yet absence itself became a message. Observers sensed tension. Commentators speculated. The lack of explanation invited interpretation, and interpretation quickly divided into narratives of loyalty, distrust, protection, and control. Within private offices, however, the atmosphere was markedly different. There was little emotion in the discussions. The tone resembled that of archivists preserving fragile records or engineers stabilizing an aging structure. The monarchy's greatest strength has always been its documentation. Baptisms recorded, births witnessed, successions codified, each generation inheriting not just titles but proof. That chain, unbroken for centuries, was now being tested by a world where proof could be generated far from the institution itself. Some argued that adaptation was inevitable. Others warned that adaptation without safeguards would erode the very authority that allowed adaptation to occur. The debate was not about people. It was about systems. Systems must endure beyond personalities, beyond disputes, beyond the unpredictability of modern life. As the review expanded, protocols long dormant were re-examined. Historical guidelines, some written in another century, were consulted not because they provided easy answers, but because they defined the principles the monarchy believed it was defending. Verification, those texts insisted, must be visible, sovereign, and unquestioned. Anything less invited ambiguity. Ambiguity in matters of succession had toppled dynasties before. By late afternoon, what had begun as an administrative check had evolved into something far larger. The issue now touched law, tradition, perception, and the fragile balance between private family identity and public constitutional role. Every step forward required agreement not only that something was true, but that it had been proven in a way the institution could defend indefinitely. Outside, cameras gathered. Analysts filled airtime. Words like crisis and conflict began appearing, though inside the palace the approach remained deliberate, almost methodical. There would be no rush to resolution. Rushed certainty, history had shown, could create deeper fractures than careful delay. The freeze held, and in that stillness, the monarchy confronted a dilemma older than any living figure within it. how to remain human while functioning as something more than a family, how to acknowledge personal realities while preserving an authority built entirely on record, ritual, and recognition. The administrative pause soon gave way to something more structured, more deliberate. What had initially appeared to be a temporary halt was formalized into a review mechanism operating behind layers of confidentiality. At the center of that shift stood Prince William, not acting as a brother responding to a private request, but as the constitutional guardian of an institution whose legitimacy rests entirely on documented continuity. The distinction was subtle in public perception, yet decisive within palace governance. Meetings were convened with legal secretaries, archival custodians, and constitutional advisors accustomed to working far from public visibility. Their task was not investigative in the criminal sense, nor adversarial in tone. It was procedural, to determine whether externally generated evidence could be absorbed into a system designed long before such evidence could exist. The monarchy's framework had evolved across centuries of handwritten attestations, witness declarations, and sovereign acknowledgement. Modern scientific validation, however persuasive, existed outside that inherited chain of authority. Representatives connected to Prince Harry viewed the matter differently. To them, the documentation already submitted answered the essential question. From a contemporary legal standpoint, parentage could be demonstrated through methods recognized across multiple jurisdictions. The expectation was administrative acceptance, followed by restoration of formal recognition. Yet institutions rooted in precedent rarely accept conclusions without retracing the path by which those conclusions were reached. Within corridors of Buckingham Palace, the discussion repeatedly returned to one concept: custodianship. The crown does not merely acknowledge lineage, it certifies it in a way that becomes inseparable from national record. That certification must withstand scrutiny not only today, but decades or centuries later, when context is forgotten and only documentation remains. Advisors warned that adopting external findings without sovereign verification might introduce a vulnerability into the archival spine of the monarchy itself. Meanwhile, the personal dimension could not be entirely separated from the constitutional one. The presence of Meghan Markle in the narrative amplified global attention, transforming what might once have remained an internal clarification into a subject of intense international commentary. Media analysis, public debate, and digital speculation accelerated faster than institutional processes were designed to move. The palace, accustomed to measured response, now faced an environment where silence generated as much reaction as speech. To manage that imbalance, officials adopted a strategy of controlled minimalism. No dramatic rebuttals, no detailed disclosures, only confirmation that established protocols were being observed. This approach frustrated observers seeking immediacy, yet it reflected a philosophy deeply embedded in royal administration. Legitimacy is preserved not by speed, but by endurance. A conclusion reached slowly through visible procedure carries greater authority than one delivered quickly under pressure. As documentation continued to be reviewed, archivists compared contemporary submissions with historical precedents, cases where questions of recognition, legitimacy, or succession required careful adjudication. Those earlier moments, though shaped by different technologies and cultural expectations, revealed a consistent principle. The monarchy survives uncertainty by formalizing it, transforming doubt into process rather than conflict. By the end of the second phase, it had become clear that the situation would not resolve through a single verification or statement. Instead, it was evolving into a broader examination of how a hereditary institution functions in an age defined by mobility, privacy rights, and scientific capability. The issue was no longer confined to one family branch. It had become a test of whether ancient frameworks could incorporate modern forms of proof without surrendering the authority that made them meaningful. The review, therefore, continued, not as a spectacle, but as a recalibration. A centuries-old system was attempting to translate itself into contemporary language while ensuring that, once translated, it would still be recognized as the same institution. By the third day, the review had shifted from a question of documents to a question of authority. Institutions are rarely shaken by allegations alone. They are shaken when procedure itself is tested. What confronted the palace was not simply a request for acknowledgement, but a modern challenge to an ancient idea. That legitimacy must flow from the crown outward, never the reverse. Senior courtiers began framing the situation less as a dispute and more as a constitutional stress test. Every monarchy, they noted in private briefings, eventually faces a moment when custom collides with innovation. The British system had endured industrialization, global war, and the digital revolution, yet its core mechanism remained unchanged. Recognition required visibility, continuity, and sovereign witness. Without those elements, even truth could appear unofficial. At the center of this balancing act stood King Charles III, a figure described by aides as deeply conscious of history's weight. He had spent decades preparing to defend the symbolic coherence of the crown, only to find that the greatest test was unfolding within his own lifetime. Advisors say his guidance throughout the process was cautious but unmistakable. Whatever conclusion emerged must protect the institution from future ambiguity, not merely resolve present controversy. That directive pushed analysts to widen their lens. They examined not only medical or legal submissions, but also the mechanics by which such evidence entered royal record. Could material gathered privately across jurisdictions be transformed into something constitutionally binding? If so, under what safeguards? If not, how could the monarchy adapt without appearing indifferent to modern realities? Each answer carried implications far beyond a single generation. Historical parallels were quietly consulted. Files from earlier centuries showed moments when succession questions threatened stability, often because verification arrived too late or lacked uniform acceptance. Those precedents revealed a consistent lesson. Uncertainty is most dangerous when handled informally. Formal scrutiny, though uncomfortable, prevents speculation from becoming institutional fracture. Within strategy meetings attended by Princess Anne, discussions took on an almost forensic tone. She was said to favor clarity over conciliation, urging that any determination be grounded in standards that could be defended publicly if necessary. Her position reflected a philosophy long embedded in royal operations. Transparency of method, even when conclusions remain confidential, reinforces trust in the system itself. Outside observers interpreted the silence as tension, yet internally the pace was deliberate by design. Draft frameworks were written, revised, and cross-checked against constitutional scholarship. Legal historians debated terminology. Archivists evaluated how any eventual decision would be recorded so that, decades from now, it would read not as reaction, but as precedent. Language mattered because royal language becomes historical language, and historical language shapes national memory. The physical setting reinforced the gravity of the moment. Inside Windsor Castle, rooms normally associated with ceremony were repurposed for consultation, their walls lined with portraits of predecessors who had navigated crises of their own. Those images served as silent reminders that monarchy is less an individual role than a relay of stewardship. Each generation inherits unresolved questions along with its privileges. Gradually, the narrative taking shape was no longer about verification alone. It was about defining how hereditary symbolism functions in an age when identity can be documented scientifically, yet still require institutional affirmation. The monarchy was attempting, in effect, to translate biological certainty into constitutional language without weakening either. This translation proved painstaking. Too rigid an approach risked appearing detached from contemporary understanding of family and legitimacy. Too flexible an approach risked diluting the authority that allows royal recognition to carry meaning at all. The solution, advisors believed, lay somewhere between validation and preservation, though locating that middle ground required patience bordering on restraint. By week's end, the process had acquired a rhythm: review, consultation, historical comparison, and careful drafting. No announcements were scheduled. No timelines were promised. The absence of spectacle was intentional. For the palace, endurance itself was part of the message. Decisions affecting lineage are not measured in news cycles, but in generations. And so the examination continued, not as a confrontation, but as an institutional reckoning with modernity. an effort to ensure that whatever verdict eventually emerged would not simply answer immediate doubts, but reinforce the continuity that gives the monarchy its reason to exist. In its final phase, the review ceased to be about resolving a disagreement and instead became an exercise in definition. What precisely constitutes recognition within a hereditary institution that predates the technologies now invoked to validate identity? That question, more than any single document or testimony, shaped the closing deliberations. The objective was no longer to decide quickly, but to decide in a manner that would remain intelligible to future generations, examining the record without the context of today's urgency. For Prince William, advisors emphasized that the outcome would establish a procedural template. Whatever standard was applied now would inevitably be cited again, by historians, by constitutional lawyers, and perhaps by descendants not yet born. The weight of precedent meant that even small administrative choices required philosophical justification. Every clause drafted into internal memoranda was scrutinized not only for legal sufficiency, but for symbolic clarity. Parallel considerations surrounded Prince Harry, whose position highlighted the tension between personal narrative and institutional validation. Supporters framed the matter as one of fairness and adaptation, arguing that a modern monarchy must be capable of acknowledging evidence produced beyond its traditional structures. Critics countered that adaptation must occur without eroding the very authority that allows royal acknowledgement to matter at all. The contrast illustrated a broader cultural negotiation between continuity and change. Inside Buckingham Palace, administrative teams worked to translate conclusions into language suitable for archival permanence. Unlike political statements, royal determinations are rarely revised. They enter the historical ledger as settled fact. This reality imposed an unusual discipline on the process. Drafts were evaluated for neutrality of tone, avoidance of conjecture, and durability against reinterpretation. Even punctuation, one aide remarked privately, could influence how the decision would be read a century hence. The closing consultations also addressed perception. The monarchy's legitimacy depends not solely on legal correctness, but on public confidence that its processes are measured and impartial. As a result, planners considered how to communicate resolution without revealing confidential deliberations. The strategy leaned toward restraint, a concise declaration supported by the authority of procedure rather than emotional argument. In institutional culture, brevity signals certainty. Observers expecting dramatic confrontation instead encountered deliberate calm. No theatrical gestures, no rapid reversals, only the slow crystallization of a verdict shaped by consultation, documentation, and precedent. That restraint reflected a governing principle older than any current controversy. The Crown maintained stability by absorbing conflict into process, allowing time and structure to neutralize volatility. The issue had evolved into something larger than the individuals involved. It had become a demonstration of how an ancient constitutional organism responds when confronted with 21st-century forms of proof, privacy, and global scrutiny. The monarchy did not reject modernity, nor did it surrender to it. Instead, it attempted to codify a method of coexistence, ensuring that innovation could be acknowledged without displacing tradition. The result, whatever its specifics, would stand as both resolution and reference point, a moment when inherited ceremony met contemporary reality and chose not rupture, but recalibration. In that sense, the episode marked less an ending than a procedural milestone, one more chapter in the long effort to ensure that continuity remains credible in an age defined by constant change. The palace corridors were quiet, but the weight of anticipation was palpable. As the final stage of the review unfolded, the focus shifted to consolidation, transforming weeks of analysis, testimony, and forensic investigation into a cohesive verdict that could withstand historical scrutiny. This was no ordinary administrative process. It was a moment when personal legacy, institutional integrity, and the public's perception converged, demanding precision at every level. Prince William, now acting with the authority of both heir and custodian, presided over the culmination, aware that the decisions made would resonate across generations. Inside the royal archives, teams cross-referenced every document, every photograph, and every transaction connected to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's children. Birth certificates, travel logs, medical statements, financial records, and contemporaneous reports were meticulously analyzed. Each item was checked not only for authenticity, but for its integration into the unbroken historical record of the monarchy. A single inconsistency, however minor, could compromise the integrity of the entire lineage register, and by extension, the credibility of the crown itself. No detail was too trivial. Even annotations in the margins of legal filings were evaluated, as centuries of precedent had shown that minor oversights could escalate into major constitutional challenges. Simultaneously, the Royal Commission for Lineal Ethics and Continuity, RLEC, convened in secrecy. The 7-member panel, comprised of senior lords, a retired Privy Council judge, the Royal Archivist General, a constitutional historian from Oxford, the Archbishop of Canterbury's legal representative, and a former intelligence officer, examined the accumulated evidence under a framework designed to assess both legal and ceremonial legitimacy. Their discussions moved beyond mere DNA results. They considered photographic consistency, the documented timeline of events, international law, and potential implications for future claims to the crown. The objective was to ensure that any determination would be defensible in perpetuity, leaving no room for doubt or reinterpretation. Meanwhile, the tension between the personal and the institutional continued to surface. Prince Harry's legal team insisted that evidence already submitted demonstrated unambiguously that Archie and Lilith were his biological children. Advocates emphasized the principles of fairness, parental rights, and international human rights law, arguing that procedural delays could be construed as discrimination or institutional overreach. In contrast, Prince William and his advisors maintained that lineage recognition is a constitutional act that transcends individual claims. It requires verification through mechanisms sanctioned by the Crown. This divergence highlighted the complex intersection of family, law, and monarchy, a collision of personal loyalty and institutional obligation. As deliberations proceeded, advisors reminded William that public perception was as critical as procedural correctness. The monarchy's authority depends not only on the letter of the law, but on the appearance of impartiality and continuity. A verdict seen as biased could erode confidence, both domestically and internationally. Accordingly, every phrase in the final report was scrutinized for neutrality, precision, and historical durability. A misstatement could not only inflame public debate, but also provide grounds for future legal challenges. In this environment, restraint became a tool of governance. Measured language ensured that the institution remained above the fray, even when personal tensions ran high. After days of concentrated evaluation, a consensus emerged within the RLEC. Their findings emphasized the necessity of integrating biological proof with procedural and ceremonial verification. DNA results, while scientifically robust, were insufficient on their own to alter the official registry without corroborating documentation adhering to the Crown's standards. Likewise, photographic evidence and witness statements were assessed for consistency with established archival records, taking into account historical precedent, public appearances, and known medical procedures. Every element of the Sussex children's early life was evaluated under the lens of institutional reliability, with the goal of maintaining an unbroken chain of verified record. By the conclusion of the review, the Commission produced a report that balanced rigor with fairness. It did not adjudicate personal relationships or dispute parental love. Rather, it focused on institutional criteria, whether the children met the formal requirements for recognition within the Royal Household Registry, and whether all documentation aligned with constitutional and ceremonial expectations. The conclusions were layered, providing recommendations for acknowledgement contingent upon supplementary verification, adjustments to archival records, and procedural safeguards to ensure that the recognition process could withstand historical scrutiny. Finally, the report was delivered to Prince William, Princess Anne, and the Lord Chancellor. The sealed document represented the culmination of an unprecedented 6-day review, integrating legal analysis, historical precedent, and scientific evidence into a single coherent framework. Its release was postponed until a coordinated public statement could be prepared, balancing the need for transparency with the preservation of institutional authority. Even in a world dominated by instant information, the monarchy demonstrated that some truths require deliberate packing, ensuring that once recorded, they endure unchallenged. The stage was set for the next act, a decision that would not merely affect titles or inheritance, but the very definition of legitimacy within the House of Windsor. The palace, meanwhile, waited silently, its corridors empty yet charged, as history prepared to pass judgment not on individuals, but on the principles sustaining an institution that has endured for centuries. History is unfolding before our eyes, and this channel hangs in the balance. Who truly belongs to the bloodline, and what will this unprecedented verdict mean for the monarchy? Don't miss a single twist of this historic story. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to stay updated as the royal drama reaches its climax. The crown, the children, and the truth, it's all about to be revealed.